Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for listening. Brian Hook is the U.S. Special Representative for Iran. He is Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State. When I moved back to the Beltway, our mutual friend, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien told me Brian Hook was the smartest guy inside the Beltway I hadn't met. I have subsequently met him, and Robert was right. Brian, good morning. Good to have you on the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Good morning, Hugh. Great to be with you.
Yesterday, news was made vis-a-vis Iran and nuclear waivers. Would you explain, especially in mind, Steelers fans are listening, they don't understand this stuff, what the waivers were and why we took one away yesterday?
Well, yeah, good question. Some time ago, Iran built a nuclear facility in the town of Fordo. This was a secret underground bunker that the regime built to conduct secret uranium enrichment work. And what Secretary Pompeo did yesterday was he took action to end the sanctions waiver on that nuclear facility, and he did it to send a clear message that Iran's effort at nuclear extortion is not going to be tolerated.
Now, there remain 3 other waivers in place for 3 other facilities, including the Tehran research reactor, which may be part of Iran's nuclear development. Are those under review?
Oh, they're under regular review. And the important thing, I think the big policy goal that we helped accomplish yesterday, when Secretary Pompeo, over a year ago, put out his list of 12 demands, at the very top is that the world's leading sponsor of terrorism cannot be allowed to enrich uranium, and they should never pursue plutonium processing. So when we heard in the case of Fordo that the Iranian regime was resuming enrichment at a facility that used to be secret, he took action and then ended that waiver. We do need to restore the UN Security Council standard of no enrichment for the Iranian regime.
Are the other 3 facilities on the table imminently, Brian Hook?
Well, it's really on a day-to-day basis. The Secretary has sanctioned a number of nuclear scientists working on the nuclear program. So he's also ended a number of nuclear waivers. You have essentially 3 left. The thing that we're looking at is any time there is an activity that we think is going to reduce the breakout time, the nuclear breakout time for Iran to get to a nuclear weapon, we move in very quickly.
Now, the country is racked by demonstrations, if we are to believe reports on the Internet, but the mullahs have also shut down the Internet, so our information is coming in piecemeal. What do you understand the situation to be, broadly speaking, in Iran this morning?
These are massive protests across the breadth and depth of the country. There are now reports of as many as a few hundred Iranians killed by the regime. And these protests started 3 days ago is in response to gas hikes. They increased the price of gasoline. But these protests have now turned into anti-regime protests, and we have seen pictures of Iranians burning images of the Ayatollah, and all over the country. These are huge protests. The Iranian people are tired of their government failing them. The Iranian people are tired of having a government that is not representative of who they are. One of the most inspiring things I saw was a woman climbing up on a pole, and she tore down a sign that the government put up that said, "Death to America."
Now, Brian Hook, we have seen regimes collapse quickly, including in Ecuador over the weekend. We hope it happens in Venezuela. Is regime collapse actually possible in Iran?
These things are very hard to predict, but we have put Iran really on a dilemma, the Iranian regime on the horns of a dilemma. They can either spend money on guns in Damascus, or they can spend it on butter in Tehran. And after the Iran nuclear deal, they were able to do both. The days of them doing both are over. And now their proxies are weaker. The regime is in its worst economic condition in its history. They are now at negative 12% GDP. That number is going to get worse. President Trump has put in place sanctions that have no historic precedent on Iran, and it is tying up the regime in a big way, and it's very hard for them to run their expansionist revolutionary foreign policy with impunity.
Now, Brian Hook, in the past, the Trump-Pompeo sanctions that you have been implementing on a day-to-day basis led to an attack on a U.S. drone, led to an attack on Saudi Arabia. It led to aggression in the Gulf. Do you expect that Iran will react to the revocation of the waiver for sanctions on Fordow with additional provocations?
I don't think that the regime has the bandwidth to manage any other problem. Their circuit boards are overloaded right now. We have protests in Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, in Yemen. You're seeing more positive trend lines there. And so when you look at the Iranian Shia crescent that they are trying to create, this arc that stretches from Lebanon all the way down to Yemen, they are experiencing massive headwinds in each of these countries. And so this is a choice that the president put in front of the regime when he came into office. You can either start behaving like a normal nation, or you can watch your economy collapse.
Now, the New York Times published a story on Monday. The Iran cable secret documents show how Tehran wields power in Iraq. It includes in part, quote, the trove of leaked Iranian intelligence report largely confirms what was already known about Iran's firm grip on Iraqi politics. The documents show how Iran, at nearly every turn, has outmaneuvered the United States in the contest for influence. It's made up of hundreds of reports and cables written mainly by Iran Ministry of Intelligence and Security. And it says that in Iraq, Lebanon, and security, which Iran considers crucial to its national security, the Revolutionary Guards, and in particular its elite Quds force led by General Soleimani, determines Iran's policy. Ambassadors to those countries are appointed from senior ranks of the Revolutionary Guards, not the foreign ministry. Does the New York Times get it right in this story, Brian Hook?
Well, the period that it covers was during the Obama administration, where I think we were outmaneuvered by the Iranians. I think President Trump has put an end to that, and now we see protests, huge protests in Iraq. Iraqi people want their country back. And yesterday, Secretary Pompeo announced his support for the protesters in Iraq, and he also said that the United States will sanction any Iraqi officials who are stealing the wealth of the Iraqi people or who are colluding with Iran in order to undermine the sovereignty and the security of the government of Iraq.
Brian Hook, a former senior United States official in the Bush administration, told me personally off the record that we have the ability to, quote, disintermediate, close quote, the offshore money of Iran's illegitimate government. They've stowed away cash in Switzerland, things like that. Do we still have that option? Is it on the table?
Well, I can't speak to the specifics of that. What I can say is that Iran's chief source of export revenue is oil. When President Trump got out of the Iran deal, they were exporting 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. That's 3% of the world's oil supply. In 13 months, that went down to a little more than 100,000 barrels of oil. Part of the reason we're seeing the protest today is because the Iranian regime didn't think that the president would be able to accomplish that, and so they put in place a government budget, and they're not able to fund their budget. They're running a 2/3 budget deficit, and as a consequence, they had to increase the price of gasoline, which has now caused the protests. So what we're seeing in Iran today is a consequence of, one, the regime's corruption, but two, very importantly, our campaign of maximum economic pressure on this regime. It's forcing them to make very tough choices like increasing the price of gas. That has then driven people into the streets who are tired of 40 years of this corrupt religious mafia.
Now, Brian Hook, in 2009, the United States committed a strategic blunder that is really almost impossible to calculate, standing aside as the Green Movement attempted to overturn corrupt election results. I gather we're not doing that this time. This interview is portion of that, Secretary Pompeo's speech yesterday. What are we doing differently than Team Obama did in 2009?
Pretty much everything. I remember in 2009, I spoke out when I was in the private sector against the president's decision to stand with the government instead of the Iranian people. You had millions of protesters all over Iran protesting the hijacking of the election. And we have reversed that completely. And we did that back in December of 2017 and in January of 2018 when we had wide-scale protests. And you had the president, the vice president, the secretary of state all standing with the Iranian people. These protests now in Iran are bigger than they were in 2017 and 2018. The Iranian people know that we stand squarely with them. President Trump said at his first UN General Assembly speech in 2017 that the longest-suffering victims of this Iranian regime are its own people.
Now, Brian Hook, you know that the Metternich of MSNBC, Ben Rhodes, will be out today saying this wouldn't have happened if we'd stayed in the Joint Comprehensive Program of Agreement, the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran deal. What's your response to the idea that we made this all worse by getting out of that ridiculous, absurd, and, in my view, illegal and constitutionally flawed agreement with Iran?
So the first point is that this deal is temporary. It's a temporary and modest non-proliferation agreement. It starts expiring in 11 months. 11 months from now, the UN arms embargo expires on the world's leading sponsor of terrorism, and that's something which Ben Rhodes negotiated. Then the rest of the deal will start expiring in out years. It is also the case that by focusing only on one aspect of Iran's threats to peace and security, that they neglected Iran's ballistic missile testing, missile proliferation, regional aggression, and hostage-taking. The deal is dead silent on all of those issues. So the Iran nuclear deal has come at the expense of peace and stability in the Middle East because Iran rightly interpreted the deal as a green light. As long as they're staying in compliance with the sweetheart nuclear deal, the international community will look the other way when they try to create their Shia crescent. And that is what's happened.
A last question, Brian Hook. Are our European allies finally coming around to our point of view, the President and the Secretary's point of view, and getting tough on Iran, which is a lawless, terrorist exporting regime?
Yes, we have seen some progress on that. The Iranian attack on Saudi Arabia on September 14th, I think, illustrated to the Europeans the point that I just made, that the Iran nuclear deal came at the expense of missile nonproliferation. And so that attack, I think, was a wake-up call to the Europeans. They said publicly, the leaders of the E3 came out and said Iran did it, and they demanded that Iran enter into negotiations to deal with the missile and the regional aggression program. That's the position of this administration.
Brian Hook, thank you for your time. U.S. Special Representative for Iran, Senior Policy Advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Thank you, Brian.
Great. Thank you, Hugh.
I like talking to newsmakers.